Now that we've talked through how climate change works and how it threatens us, this is the section on what we can do to fix it. And for those who didn't listen to the end of the last video, this is my favorite section. It's the only optimistic one in these slides. And I'm really excited to get started. It walks through the path that we need to take to fully decarbonize the global economy through making electricity renewable, through figuring out ways to develop clean fuels, carbon capture, and other techniques we can use. The key case here is that clean technology is already being rapidly developed and deployed. There's been really exciting progress. That said, given what we've covered about how quickly the climate threat is escalating, we need to accelerate the development and deployment of clean technology even faster. Now let's talk through our steps to freedom from fossil fuels and from climate change. Now, the speed of climate change is determined by total carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this gap between the pre-industrial era and the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today, the wider that gap is, the faster Earth's climate is going to heat up. And so our net emissions right now are making that gap wider, but even if those emissions suddenly somehow cut to zero, that gap would still be driving climate change to keep getting worse. So what are the steps we need to take to mitigate that? Well, the first is getting those emissions as close to zero as we can. We can adopt clean technology to power civilization while producing less and less carbon dioxide, so that at least we're making the problem worse at a slower and slower rate. But that is not going to address that gap. So what is the next step we need to do to start shrinking it? That is carbon dioxide removal. This is the opposite of what we've been doing for the last few hundred years. Instead of pulling carbon-based fuel out of the Earth's interior and burning it in the atmosphere, we need to extract carbon from the atmosphere and then store it permanently. And that is what is going to enable us to start shrinking that gap, making climate change more and more under control until eventually we can get Earth back to the level of 280 parts per million of atmospheric CO2 and restore a stable pre-industrial climate. Now, there are also some additional steps that we're going to talk through that are not a replacement for cutting emissions and for CO2 removal, but they are a way to potentially buy emergency time for those steps to work. So with that, let's step into details on the finer points of all of these steps. Let's talk through the steps to cutting our emissions. We're actually going to break this step out into a few different subsections over the next handful of slides. As a way to frame the different challenges we face here, let's think about the way that energy flows through the economy. So first, at the end point, energy demand from residential, industrial, commercial, and transport customers. Now, all of these users are able to cut their emissions by investing in efficiency. So these are things like installing more efficient light bulbs in an office building, or using a more efficient process to make steel that needs less fuel. Any mechanism that allows these users to get the same output using less energy means that they will have lower emissions. Now let's take a step back from those customers to how energy is used. This falls into two categories. The first is electricity. Anytime that power is transmitted through wires in the electrical grid to be used as electric power. The second category, used directly, is any fuel that is taken by a customer and then used on site in some way. So examples are jet fuel that is pumped into airplanes and then burned in the air, or natural gas that is pumped to houses to be burned for heating. Now, the challenges of decarbonizing these two uses of energy are very different, and as a result, we're going to cover them on separate slides. But sourcing each type of energy cleanly is a critical part of cutting our emissions. Now, when I say cleanly, what exactly does that mean? If we go back to the original step of where our energy comes from, we can break it into three categories. Renewable, with the most important sources currently, being solar, wind, and hydropower, as well as there are a couple of others, biomass, geothermal. I didn't have space to include everything in here. But those are clear wins in terms of zero carbon generation of electricity. Now, the next one is a bit more complicated. So nuclear power I've labeled clean-ish because there is still a very active debate within the environmental and clean technology movement over whether nuclear should be considered clean. It emits no carbon, but it does involve the creation of radioactive waste. So if this deck gets enough attention and I get to do more work like this, nuclear is one of the first questions that I want to dive more into. But for now, I'm going to completely avoid that debate just to keep this deck concise. So putting nuclear in its own special bucket is clean from a carbon perspective, but also kind of its own thing. And then finally, there are fossil fuels. Oil, coal, and natural gas are fundamentally carbon-based fuels. You burn them, you emit carbon into the atmosphere. So the more that we can shift from fossil fuels to clean sources of power, the more we're going to be able to cut our emissions. Let's walk through what we can do to get to clean electricity. So renewable electricity today is on a wave of new deployments, driven by innovation that has slashed its costs over the last 10 years. So if we look at this chart of electricity generation costs over the last 10 years, solar and wind have gone from the most expensive ways to generate power to the least expensive over this time period. And levelized cost just means the cost for a unit of power over the entire lifetime of a facility. So this means that for a new facility being built, then solar and wind are the cheapest ways to generate new electricity. Now, also one note we should go through, hydropower is not referenced here because hydropower is really a special case. You need to have a river suitable for it. And for the most part, rivers that are suitable for hydropower have already been used. So the revolution here in new deployments is really for solar and wind, which can be deployed in a much wider range of places. Now, even with them leading a revolution, renewable electricity is not going to fully take over global electricity generation for a while. In 2018, about 25% of global electricity generation was renewable. Let's look at some forecasts of where that will be by 2050. The first and the most pessimistic mainstream forecast I found was the US Energy Information Agency at 49%. The Bloomberg New Energy Outlook estimates 69%. And then the International Renewable Energy Agency's 2 degrees Celsius plan, which we talked about in section 2. This would require reallocating some existing planned energy investment and also adding additional investment for renewables. So it requires investment above what we currently expect. Even that would only get to 86% by 2050. So even in that most optimistic case, the world is still going to have to rely somewhat on non-renewable electricity sources, even in 2050. Let's talk about some of the barriers that renewables have to overcome before they can fully take over global electricity grids. Now, these challenges come in the form of storage and transmission. On the storage side, given that the sun is not always shining and the wind is not always blowing, the amount of electricity these sources generate varies over time. And this is an issue because current batteries built for the grid scale of power have limits to how long they can store energy for. And so with that limit at about 6 hours, if you have a particularly cloudy day, in order to guarantee electricity supply, you still need to have some non-renewable on-demand power available to balance out the renewables that are not currently available. So there are some emerging solutions to this problem. First, there are a huge range of new ways to store energy currently in development, from new types of batteries to other more unique forms of energy storage. There's also the possibility of using extra renewable energy to manufacture clean fuels, especially hydrogen. Now, we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but this is a solution that can answer a few different problems at once. On the transmission side, this is due to the inconvenience that a lot of the best renewable energy sites tend to be areas that are far away from the cities and the factories where most power is consumed. And even in most developed countries, power grids are not currently equipped to be able to connect the massive amount of new renewable electricity sources supply to demand. And so there are solutions here too. Long distance power lines need and are getting more investment and support across the world. This is another area where clean fuels could come in handy, because if we switch to a system where large-scale renewable energy sites transmit some of their power as electricity, but then are also generating fuel on site, then we could use pipelines, for instance, ones that already exist for natural gas transmission, to pump those fuels to other areas. So it would mean that we don't need to fully rely on transmission to solve this problem. But whatever solutions we use, we need to find ways to solve these problems before electricity grids can rely fully on renewable power to fully cut their emissions. Now that we've covered how to cut emissions from the electricity sector, let's talk about how to cut them from the fuel supply chain. So here in the middle are some example uses of direct burning of fossil fuels. We have two options to decarbonize these. The first is conversion to run on electricity. This is an option for vehicles, which can be electric, and for indoor heating, which can rely on electric heat pumps instead of burning natural gas. Once these systems are electrified, as long as they're running on renewable electricity, they are running cleanly without any emissions. This is not an option for some parts of the economy. So for instance, the heavy industry, where steel making requires temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Current technology for renewables and batteries cannot yet provide that. Same for heavy aviation. Large aircraft currently are not able to run on batteries alone. Small aircraft can, but it's going to take more development to get to large aircraft. The second option, which is possible across these uses, is conversion to run on clean fuels. And there are different fuels that can fall into this category. One that is generating the most excitement right now is hydrogen, which can be manufactured cleanly only from water and renewable power. The issue is that hydrogen manufactured in that way is still too expensive to take over all of the parts of the economy that currently run on fuels. That said, as we saw in the clean electricity section, when there is a lot of investment and when there are a lot of very smart people working on a challenge like this, it's possible for costs to plunge very rapidly. So this is absolutely an area to watch, which is going to enable breakthroughs that could make it possible to remove emissions from a huge sector of the economy. There are still going to be some applications that are tough to address with both of these, but between these two options, we'll be able to cut carbon emissions out of the vast majority of global economic activity. So this is an area to keep watching very closely, because with this problem solved, and with this technology becoming more and more cost effective, between this and energy efficiency as well as clean electricity, we'll be able to vastly cut emissions across the entire global economy. And the only question will be how quickly we can deploy these technologies. Now that we've covered the technology that could slash our carbon dioxide emissions across the global economy, let's talk about how to address that remaining carbon dioxide gap. Looking here at the bottom, again, even if we cut those net emissions to almost zero, we're still looking at a large gap between the pre-industrial and modern carbon dioxide levels. So to address that, we need large-scale carbon dioxide removal. There are a lot of methods that we could potentially use here. I'm going to talk about three main ones, but definitely an area with a lot of additional ideas moving around. The first one I'll talk about is planting new forests. When new trees are planted, they absorb carbon into their cells and into the soil. Now, if those forests are cut down, that carbon is re-released. But if we protect them, it's stored permanently. Now, This method costs about $10 billion to $100 billion per ppm of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere every year. It's got a maximum rate of 1.7 ppm per year because there's only so much land available in the world that could hold forests and does not currently hold them. So for ways to get beyond that, what are some other options? One is the mouthful, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, also known as BECCS. And this is burning crops or other biomass in sealed chambers, which can generate power while the carbon that is released gets captured and stored permanently. This is more expensive but has a higher maximum rate. Now it's still limited by land use constraints, 2.4 ppm per year. That's from a study that looked at how much land could be devoted to growing crops for BECCS without compromising the global food supply. So there's another option that has a much higher maximum withdrawal limit than these two, direct air capture. And these are large facilities that use chemical reactions to draw carbon dioxide directly from the air and then store it permanently. This is currently looking like the most expensive large-scale carbon dioxide removal method. As technology develops, that price is still in debate, but right now it looks like it will be pretty pricey. That said, if we can get the investment to use this method, it could really take away a lot of carbon and make a big difference in reducing that gap very quickly. So with these methods and with everything we talked about in cutting emissions, these are all we need to get climate change under control and then to reverse it. Now, many of these technologies definitely are still in development, especially on the clean fuel and carbon capture side. That said, they already work. We're already using them. We just need to make them cheaper and then massively scale them up. And with that, we're going to have everything we need to draw the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere back towards that pre-industrial total, bringing the climate back towards its pre-industrial state. Now, in case we can't get that to happen fast enough to avert catastrophic damage from climate change, let's talk about some of the emergency options that we could use to buy ourselves more time. The emergency brake section of this deck is going to cover a technology called geoengineering. And the specific type that I'm going to talk about is called solar geoengineering or solar radiation management. But there are other types that scientists are actively debating. This is just one of the most prominent ones out there. The natural inspiration for solar geoengineering is when major volcanic eruptions shoot sulfur compounds high into the stratosphere. Once they're up there, strong winds push them around the globe, and because they're reflective, they reflect away a small portion of sunlight, cooling the Earth for a brief period of time. Now, those compounds fall back to the surface over a couple of years, and the cooling effect goes away. The classic example of this was the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, which reflected away about 1% of sunlight over more than a year, cooling the Earth by about 0.5 degrees Celsius for that time. So seeing that work in nature, scientists have wondered if there is a way to duplicate it artificially by flying aircraft in the stratosphere to release reflective particles. Now, once that happened, the dispersal and return phases would work the same as they do naturally. So this could be a way to stall warming, to buy us more time to build a global renewable economy, which sounds great in theory, but the next slide is going to cover some of the pros and cons for how this would actually work. Let's start with the pros. Solar geoengineering could be an incredibly cost-effective way to slow down global warming. Looking at the circles here on the left, this gray outer circle is a study we've talked about before in these slides. $500 billion per year is the total that it's estimated on top of reallocating some existing planned energy investments that could limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Now, in comparison to that, actual global investment in new clean energy in 2019 was about $280 billion. Solar geoengineering would be vastly cheaper than both of these options. It's estimated that $2.3 billion would be the annual cost for a geoengineering aircraft fleet, which could cut the rate of further global warming in half. Now, this fleet would require 95 aircraft over the first 15 years, which seems like a lot, but in comparison, FedEx had almost 700 aircraft in its fleet in 2020. So the benefits to this are that this is a fast, cheap, and nature-proven way to reduce the symptoms of climate change. And I use symptoms very intentionally. It does not address the root problem, but it would reduce the warming that we're facing. Now, there are also some solvable issues. That's still an area of open debate. Some scientists have proposed that this could affect the ozone layer or global rainfall patterns. And there are a lot of papers on those, as well as counter papers arguing about different ways that geoengineering could be modified in order to avoid those impacts. I definitely recommend checking the sources on this one. This is by far the longest sources page I have in the entire slide deck. And that gives a sense for the academic back and forth currently going on here. But regardless of those issues which might be solvable, the core challenge here is moral hazard. It's that reducing the threat of climate change using geoengineering could reduce the incentive to invest in solving its root causes. You know, if people say, okay, well, geoengineering has us covered cheaply, we don't need to invest in the expensive and hard steps of decarbonizing the global economy, that is a serious risk. And that is why I'm going to end this section where I began it, emphasizing that geoengineering is not a substitute for these earlier steps. It's important to note that even many of the scientists who are leading research on geoengineering hope that it will never have to be used. That said, they also make their fair point that just in case we continue on this dangerous trajectory of warming, or in case we later find out that we're rapidly approaching a critical threshold beyond which catastrophic damage is going to begin, we should have done some research beforehand to know what our options might be if we have to pull that emergency brake. Research on geoengineering is important, but cutting emissions and removing CO2 are our clear, undeniable path to freedom from fossil fuels and from climate change. They need to be our top priority for near-term, full-scale development and deployment as fast as possible. Thank you for joining me on this walkthrough of technologies we can use to address this challenge and our last section of this deck. After this, we'll wrap it up with one final conclusion slide.